All right. Hi again, everyone. Here we are talking about sections 1.6 and 1.7. Essentially, let's talk about the Constitution and the implications of separation of powers and checks and balances in the U.S. political system. So, this is hopefully going to be shorter than my previous 20-minute video about the Constitutional Convention. But this is going to be a very important one. What we're talking about is just basically the layout of the Constitution, which you all need to know, and then the implications of that. So, first off, this is a living document. The Constitution itself is able to change in a ton of different ways. The Articles was stagnant, it was considered a dead document. You couldn't really amend it at all. There's really hard to pass laws, things like that. The Constitution addresses this. In order to pass a law, all you need is a simple majority. It's called a quorum, which is Latin for, I'm assuming, majority, maybe. Whereas we're actually able to add amendments as well. There's 27 amendments added to the Constitution. It's not a lot, but they are a lot of. There's still more than the original articles, which was zero. We also have a way to change the meaning of the document, which oftentimes legally is easier to do than actually adding something onto it. The federal judiciary is able to actually change the meaning of things. Great example. The 14th Amendment was only meant to give citizenship to African Americans who were recently freed after the Civil War. Thanks to the 13th Amendment, it is now expanded to the point where it incorporates the Bill of Rights to the states. It makes everyone a citizen regardless of your heritage. It also makes sure that you have equal rights and due process. It is a Swiss Army knife of amendments. It is amazing. I'm going to be talking about it very soon. Well, in 2 units, but I'm talking about a lot. It is one of the most important amendments in the entire Constitution, but it was never meant to be that. It was simply meant to give rights to recently freed African Americans. So that's why it's a living document, because our federal judiciary is able to change things. The articles didn't have a federal judiciary, so they weren't able to change things informally. Anyway, the very beginning of the Constitution, it's called the preamble. There are three sections of the Constitution. There's the preamble, there's the articles, and there is the should do that. There is the amendments. The preamble is one sentence. It's a long running sentence. It's actually starts off with a grammatically incorrect phrase, more perfect union. You can't make things more perfect. I know what they're getting at, but it's essentially a thesis for what our country is going to become. This is the why we're going to do it. Um, Here they are. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So these six goals are seen all throughout the Constitution. This is what they wanted to do, and this is what they carried out in the following seven articles. You can see what the seven articles are. I'm not going to go through every single one, but notably, the first articles are incredibly important. Article 1 creates the Congress, the legislative branch. It is the largest article in the Constitution. It's about 45% of all the words in the original Constitution. They honestly thought that Congress is going to be the most important branch. They actually call it the first branch of the government, partly because what they experienced was in England, Parliament was the most important branch of the government, and that's the legislature. It still is incredibly important, but the presidency has really expanded. Article 2 talks about the presidency. They actually were pretty ambiguous in a lot of things they've said. They were pretty nebulous in a lot of the article, a lot of the powers. They said the president can make executive orders. They didn't explain what an executive order was because they didn't know what the presidency was going to be. George Washington was the first president of the United States, but he was really the first president in the world. No other country had an executive along the same lines as President Washington, so they're really hoping he was going to flesh out a lot of that. So what we really have in the government is a lot of our government's based off of norms and traditions established by people like George Washington. But one thing that's constant from Washington all the way to Trump is that we have each president tries to expand the power of the presidency. No one likes to be told no, especially if you're going to become president. Because if you're president, there's a certain level of narcissism that you have to have. So you don't like being told no if you get to that point, and if you're in charge of the government, and people really have a hard time saying no, especially legally, you get away with a lot of stuff. And then Article 3 is the Supreme Court. This is the shortest. This is like 3 paragraphs. Like that's about it in Article 3. It's very short. They weren't expecting the Supreme Court to be a much. Early on, the Supreme Court literally traveled between different states to hear cases. And it wasn't until John Marshall in 1803 ish, 1801, sorry, where he actually created the Supreme Court we know of today. But even then, the Supreme Court didn't have its own building until 1920, and it was thrown around there. They are basically in the basement of the Capitol building. So those are the 3 most important articles. Obviously, 4 talks about state powers, 5 describes the amendment process, 6 talks about federal laws above all others, which is essentially the supremacy clause, which is incredibly important. And then Article 7 talks about ratification, how to improve it, how to approve it. Essentially, 9 out of 13 states have to approve it, ratify it. That's it. That carries over to the amendment process. We have to have 3/4 of the states ratify any amendment, and that was how you had to ratify the Constitution. So it just kind of carries over the same requirements, which makes total sense. So we're going to kind of burn through this. So Article 1 talks about the legislative branch. You know the Senate. Every state has two senators. California, who has 40 million people, has 2 senators. Wyoming, that has 40 people, also has 2 senators because it's equality of the states. The senators represent the states, not necessarily you and me. Well, they do listen to us, but they don't necessarily listen to their goal is to represent the state itself, not necessarily just you and me. House of Representatives, though, is based on population, whereas California has like 53 or 54 representatives. Wyoming has just the 1 because they want to make sure that is a more populous, populous branch, whereas they represent you and me, and they want to be responsible to you and me. So if they do something that you and I don't like, we can vote them out within 2 years. Senators also serve for 6 years to try to insulate themselves from the mob. Our founding fathers thought that you and I were idiots, so they try to do as much as they possibly can to insulate the federal government from you and me. A good example: the president's elected by the Electoral College. The federal judiciary is appointed by the president and approved by the Senate, which is not selected by you and me, and the House of Representatives is voted by us. So 1/4 of the national government is appointed by us, and outside of that, nothing else. So we have a little bit of a say, but that's about it. Our founding fathers didn't trust us. However, Congress has incredibly important powers. Very important to know. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress its 17 important powers. The 18th power, there's an 18th a clause on there. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, it's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. This says that Congress can make any laws that are necessary and proper to carry out the other 17 powers that they have. What are those other 17 powers? They can make laws. That's the first power the legislative branch has. They can make taxes, levy taxes. It says set taxes, but it's levy taxes. Declare war, override vetoes, borrow money, regulate internal and national commerce. They can print money. They can establish courts, post offices, all this stuff. Congress has the ability to do. That's part of the reason why it's such a big part of the Constitution. They can do all of this. But they also realized that part of the problem that the Articles had was that it constricted the legislative branch too much. So what they did was they added that necessary and proper clause, saying that as long as you can just connect it to one of these 17 powers, you can do it. Great example is that Congress can raise an army and a navy. That's one of the powers that they have. But in the 1940s, the Air Force became much more important. They didn't know what an Air Force was. They had hot air balloons. That was about it back then. So Congress has the ability to raise an Air Force. You have to assume they have that ability because they have the ability to raise an army. Military, to kind of extrapolate a little bit. So essentially, Congress can pass any law they want as long as it connects to one of the 17 original enumerated powers that they have in the Constitution. Article 2, the executive branch. This has become much more important as time has gone on. The president and vice president are elected to 4-year terms. You know that. Amendment 22 says that the president can only serve 2 full terms. In order to become president, you have to be 35 years old. 14-year resident of the United States, and a natural-born citizen. Now, a lot of this is up for interpretation. Like a good example is Eisenhower. Eisenhower never spent 14 consecutive years in the United States. His dad was a general. He was a general. He was all over the place. Congress basically said, or the Supreme Court said, yeah, you can run for president because it just says 14. Natural born citizens, another one. Ted Cruz, which is currently a senator from Texas, he ran for president like a ton of times. He wasn't born in the United States. He's a Canadian, but his dad was an American, and that transfers over as a naturalized citizen from birth. So he's able to do that. They're elected by the Electoral College, which is actually not a popular vote. It is each state gets a set number of votes based on their denominator or their delegation to Congress, and that all goes towards the president based on the popular vote within the state. We'll talk more about that later on, but it's very controversial. Now it is. It hasn't always been. The important powers of the president. He's a commander in chief, which is something he uses a lot. He is in charge of the military. He has he can pretty much do anything he wants as far as the military is concerned, short of like invading China or Russia. He can also grant pardons, which is immutable. You can't check that power. He can grant anyone. The current president, Donald Trump, he just granted a commutation, which is a shortening of the sentence to Rod Blagojevich, who was the governor of Illinois, who got thrown in jail for trying to take bribes to give Barack Obama's former Senate seat to someone who paid him for it. So if something is, I'm going to say corrupt as that, no one can check that. He can make treaties. He can appoint federal officers. There's over 5,000 federal officers the president can actually appoint. So it's a lot of power in the bureaucracy. But most importantly, his biggest job is to ensure laws are executed. This is the executive branch. His job is in charge of executing the laws. Now, President Trump or President Obama or what have you, their job, like they're not going to like sit in the side of the highway with a radar gun and make sure that you're following the law. You're not going 56 miles an hour. But they're in charge of the apparatus, the organization that's there to do it. They're in charge of the bureaucracy, which is part of the executive branch. It's about 3 million people large, and they're in charge of carrying out the law. It goes everything from the president to the cabinet, all the way down to the postman or postwoman who gives you your letters. Article 3, the judiciary. The Supreme Court judges and serves for life unless impeached. No Supreme Court justice has ever been impeached, but federal judges have been. I'm trying to do the math in my head, but we've had about 12 federal judges impeached in our history and kicked out of office. But ultimately, you pretty much serve life, which is incredibly important, incredibly powerful. If you're a president and you appoint someone as a federal judge, they could be in charge long after you're dead. Ronald Reagan, who died in early 2000s, still has judges. This is 2020. He still has judges on the federal judiciary making policy. So 15 years-ish after he died, Reagan's still essentially affecting our policy today. Very powerful tool. Judicial power rests with the Supreme Court and other courts created by Congress. We're going to get more into this in a couple of units. The important powers, though, is that they decide cases of constitutional law and federal law. Essentially, Marbury v. Madison established this idea of judicial review, where the federal judiciary can decide the constitutionality of an action of another branch of government. Incredibly important. There's a whole crazy story, which I'll get into later, but incredibly important power that the federal judiciary has. Article 4, relations among the states. Essentially what it says is if I'm driving through Indiana and I get pulled over by a cop, they have to acknowledge my Illinois driver's license because they have to recognize my rights. However, Indiana also has to grant the rights of all their citizens to me as well. So, or vice versa. So let's say someone from Indiana has come to Illinois and they want to buy some marijuana. It is legal to buy marijuana in Illinois right now. So, although it's not in Indiana, doesn't matter. If they're in Illinois, they can buy marijuana and bring it back to Indiana. If they bring it back to Indiana, they can still get a fine and all that good stuff. However, we have to say that, okay, you're in Illinois, you are subject to all of our laws, but you also get all the rights that we afford you as well. How the Constitution works, we talk about the checks and balances, that each branch checks each other and they also balance each other, and that's the part that people forget. Like the legislative branch passes bills, but they rely on the president to actually sign them. That's a balance. A check is if the president, or if the Congress passes the law and the president vetoes it. That's a classic check. Other important articles, Article 5 just talks about the amendment process we talked about in the last video. Article 6 talks about federal power. This is the supremacy clause. If a state power and a federal power, their laws contradict each other, the federal government wins. We already talked about amendments already. The Bill of Rights are an important part because obviously they've expanded the right to other people. Other important amendments you guys have to know about is the 13th Amendment. They have obviously abolished slavery. 14th Amendment expand due process and equal protection under the law. All persons born in the U.S. are citizens. This is incredibly important. Like I said, the 14th Amendment is like the best amendment. It's our Swiss Army knife of amendments. 15th Amendment said that you have the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous state of servitude. So basically, any African American can vote. That's pretty much what it said. However, Jim Crow laws kept people from voting without ever mentioning race. So technically, at the time, it didn't go against the 15th Amendment. So obviously, they were bad. They were corrupt. It was an injustice. However, it didn't technically go against the 15th Amendment. Clearly, in the 1950s, our Supreme Court changed the interpretation. But these Reconstruction amendments, these Civil War amendments, are incredibly important. It was the biggest jump in civil rights in American history. 18th Amendment says a prohibition of alcohol. The 21st Amendment repealed that. So the best way to remember is at 18, you can't drink alcohol, but at 21, now you can. My dad actually was able to drink beer when he was 18. He's that old. And he wasn't able to drink after he actually had my mom and my dad had my older sister early, and my dad was able to drink beer in high school when he was 18, but he wasn't able to drink for 2 years after he had my sister. It was a weird situation. Anyway, 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, that's 1920, very important. This is actually videotaped in the 100th year anniversary of that, the centennial of that. 22nd Amendment says the presidents are only 2 terms, so 22nd Amendment, 2 terms. 24th Amendment prohibits poll taxes for voting, saying you can't charge people to vote. That's ridiculous. And the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. The 26th Amendment was actually had one of the shortest turnarounds from being proposed to being ratified by the states. The biggest reason is at the time it was ratified, it was the Vietnam War. 18-year-olds were being sent to war to die for America, for the policies to be made, but they weren't allowed to vote yet. That doesn't mean, though, that a state couldn't say you're 17, you're 16, you can still vote. That just says that's the highest you can keep people from voting is 18. Like Illinois, you can vote at the age of 17 in a primary as long as you're going to be 18 by the time the actual election takes place. I'll explain it more in class. All right, don't worry about this class discussion because again, we'll talk about it in class. Obviously, moving on. Whoa, there's a whole lot more. That's going to be the next video. Kiddos, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next time.